What if love isn't tested by distance, but by the way the world looks at you? Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet moment in Sappa, where James and Diep discover that love isn't just about staying close to each other, but about standing together when they're judged, misunderstood, and made to feel like they don't belong. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Morning arrives quietly in Sappa, wrapped in thick, pale fog that softens every sound and blurs the edges of the small mountain village. The wooden house they're staying in feels suspended between clouds, as if the world below has temporarily disappeared. James is already awake. He moves slowly, careful not to make noise, his steps light against the old wooden floor. Outside, the air is cold enough to sting his lungs, and each breath he exhales turns into a faint white mist. Inside the room, Diep is still asleep. She's curled slightly on her side, her hands tucked close to her chest, her breathing slow and steady. The thin blanket has slipped down during the night, leaving her shoulders exposed to the cold. James pauses at the doorway, watching her for a moment longer than necessary. There's something about mornings like this that makes everything feel more fragile. He gently lifts the blanket and pulls it back over her shoulders, tucking it in the way someone would without thinking, purely out of habit and care. The kettle begins to warm on the small stove. Its quiet hum blends with the distant sound of wind moving through the mountains. James pours water into 2 old ceramic cups, the kind that don't match but somehow belong together. He glances back toward the bed again, half expecting Diep to wake, but she doesn't. Instead, she shifts slightly, her face relaxing even more, as if she senses his presence. When Diep finally opens her eyes, the room is filled with soft morning light filtered through fog. For a brief moment, she's disoriented, unsure of where she is. Then she sees James sitting near the window, one knee pulled up, his hands wrapped around a warm cup. He looks up when he notices her stirring. Their eyes meet, and neither of them looks away. "Morning," he says quietly. She smiles, small and unguarded. "You've been up for a while, haven't you?" "Not really," he replies, even though they both know it's not true. Diep sits up slowly, pulling the blanket around herself. The cold seeps in immediately, and she shivers without meaning to. James stands and drapes his jacket over her shoulders before she can say anything. She doesn't protest. She just holds the jacket closed and breathes in, catching the faint scent of him. For a second, she closes her eyes. They eat breakfast at the small wooden table by the window. It's simple food, nothing special. But there's a quiet intimacy in the way they sit across from each other, knees almost touching. James notices Diep pushing the better portion of food toward him, then stopping herself and pulling it back with a faint smile. "You eat," she says. "You're the one who gets cold easily." He doesn't argue, instead he slides the bowl back toward her. "So do you." She laughs softly, shaking her head, but she lets it stay where it is. Neither of them mentions how comfortable this feels, how natural. It's the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. After breakfast, they step outside together. The fog is thicker now, wrapping the narrow dirt path in a muted grey. The village feels barely awake. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then goes quiet. Diep hesitates for just a second before reaching for James's hand. When her fingers lace with his, he feels a small jolt of surprise. Not because she hasn't done it before, but because this time, it's deliberate. She doesn't let go. They walk slowly, their footsteps leaving faint impressions in the damp earth. Diep leans slightly closer to him as they move, as if the cold has given her an excuse to stay near. James adjusts his pace to match hers without thinking. There's no destination in mind, no plan, just movement. They stop at a low stone ledge overlooking the terraced fields. The fog shifts, revealing glimpses of green below before swallowing them again. Diep sits down first, and James follows, close enough that their shoulders touch. She rests her head against his shoulder, light at first, testing. When he doesn't move away, she lets more of her weight settle there. "I like it here," she says after a while. "It feels quiet in a good way." James nods, like the world isn't asking anything from us. She hums softly in agreement. Her fingers absent-mindedly trace small shapes on the back of his hand. There's a vulnerability in the gesture, something open and unguarded. After a long pause, she speaks again, her voice barely above the wind. "When I'm with you," she says, "I don't feel like I have to be strong all the time." James turns slightly to look at her. She doesn't lift her head, but he knows she means it. He doesn't try to fix it, doesn't respond with reassurance or promises. He just stays there, letting her words exist between them. They head back toward the village as the fog begins to thin. A few people are out now, moving with purpose. Conversations stop briefly as James and Diep pass. It's subtle, just a fraction too long of a glance, a look that lingers. Diep feels it immediately. Her grip on James's hand loosens, her fingers slipping free as she takes half a step back. At the small market, the air feels different, less gentle. A vendor looks them up and down before naming a price that's noticeably higher than what's written on the sign behind them. Diep notices. Her shoulders tense, and she shakes her head slightly. "It's okay," she murmurs to James. "Let's go." James doesn't move right away. He doesn't raise his voice or argue. He simply tightens his hold on her hand again, grounding her in place. The vendor glances between them, uncomfortable now. "We'll take it," James says calmly. Outside, Diep exhales, the tension draining slowly from her posture. "I don't like that feeling," she admits, "like we don't belong." James looks at her, really looks at her. "Not everyone needs to understand us," he says. "That doesn't mean we're wrong for being here." She nods, but the doubt lingers in her eyes. As they walk back toward the house, the warmth from earlier feels more fragile now, tested by something neither of them can fully control. Still, James reaches for her hand again, and this time, Diep doesn't pull away. The walk back to the wooden house feels longer than it should, even though the path is the same one they took earlier that morning. The fog has thinned, but the air is still cold, and the silence between them carries more weight now. Diep keeps her eyes on the ground, watching her steps, as if concentrating hard enough might keep unwanted thoughts from catching up. Inside the house, the door closes with a soft click. The familiar creak of the wooden floor greets them, steady and unchanged, and for a moment it feels like the outside world has been shut out completely. James sets his bag down and leans against the wall, watching Diep as she shrugs off his jacket and hangs it carefully on a hook by the door. She doesn't turn around right away. "I know it's not a big deal," she says finally, her voice quiet but tight. "People look. People judge. It happens everywhere." James doesn't interrupt. He waits. "But it still hurts," she continues. "Not because of what they think, but because it reminds me that no matter where we go, we'll always be outsiders to someone." She turns to face him now. Her eyes are steady, but there's a vulnerability there she doesn't try to hide. James crosses the room slowly, stopping just close enough for her to feel his presence without pressure. "When I was younger," he says, "I used to think if I worked hard enough, if I became good enough, people would stop looking down on me." She listens, her arms folding loosely around herself. "They didn't," he adds. "Some just found new reasons." Diep lets out a small, breathless laugh that sounds more tired than amused. "So it never really ends?" "No," James says honestly, "but the way it feels can change." He reaches for her hand, not pulling her closer, just holding it. It changes when you're not facing it alone. They spend the afternoon inside, letting the cold settle outside without fighting it. Diep lights the small stove, and James chops vegetables on the low wooden counter. Their movements fall into a quiet rhythm, familiar and comforting. Every now and then, their shoulders brush, and neither of them pulls away. As the soup simmers, Diep leans against the counter, watching James work. Do you ever get tired, she asks suddenly, of always having to be the strong one? James pauses, knife resting against the board. He thinks for a moment before answering. I used to, he admits. Now I just get tired of pretending I'm not. She steps closer, resting her forehead lightly against his arm. It's a small gesture, but it carries trust, a silent acknowledgement that she understands more than she says. He sets the knife aside and wraps an arm around her shoulders, pulling her gently against him. They stand like that for a while, listening to the quiet bubbling of the pot and the wind brushing against the walls. Night falls early in Sappa. By the time they sit down to eat, darkness has already wrapped itself around the house. The single bulb above the table casts a warm yellow glow, making the small space feel softer, safer. Outside, faint voices drift through the air. Laughter, conversation, life going on beyond their walls. Diep stirs her soup absent-mindedly. Do you think it'll be like this everywhere? She asks. The looks, the questions, the feeling of not quite fitting in. James takes a slow sip before answering. Sometimes, he says. Probably. She nods, her gaze dropping to the table. I'm not sure how many times I can pretend it doesn't affect me. You don't have to pretend, he says gently. Not with me. That makes her look up. There's a flicker of emotion in her eyes, relief mixed with fear. What if it gets worse, she asks. What if one day I don't want to step outside at all? James reaches across the table, covering her hand with his. Then we stay inside, he says without hesitation. Or we leave, or we find somewhere else. We decide together. After dinner, James pulls out the folded map from his bag and lays it on the table. The paper is creased, the edges worn. Diep watches him closely, unsure of what this moment means. He doesn't open it right away. I brought this because I thought I was ready, he says. Ready to go anywhere, anytime. She waits, her heart beating a little faster. But today, he continues, made me realise something. He finally unfolds the map, smoothing it out with his hands. Lines and names spread across the table, places waiting to be reached. Diep studies it, then looks back at him. I don't want to go anywhere that makes you feel smaller, James says quietly. And I don't want to stay anywhere just because I'm afraid to move. Diep swallows. What if I'm the one holding you back? He shakes his head immediately. You're the reason I'm choosing where to stand. She reaches out, folding the map closed again, her hands resting over his. I don't know when I'll be ready, she says, but I know I don't want to face those looks alone. James meets her gaze. You won't. Later, as they prepare for bed, the wind outside picks up, rattling the window lightly. Diep sits on the edge of the bed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. James turns off the light, leaving only the faint glow from outside filtering through the curtains. In the darkness, Diep speaks softly. If we keep going, there will be more days like today. James lies down beside her, close enough that she can feel the warmth of him. Yes, he answers. She turns to face him, her voice barely a whisper. Then promise me one thing. Anything. If the world keeps looking down on us, she says, don't let me forget how you look at me. James doesn't respond with words. Instead, he reaches for her hand in the dark, threading his fingers through hers, firm and steady. I won't, he says at last. You'll never stand alone. Outside, the fog rolls back in, pressing softly against the windows, blurring the edges of the world once more. Inside the small wooden house, two figures lie side by side, choosing each other again, not in defiance of what waits beyond the door, but in quiet understanding of it. And somewhere between staying and leaving, between fear and hope, a new decision begins to take shape.
Xin chào mọi người. Trong tập này, Linda nhờ bà cậu cháu ra nướng mía, rồi nằm sớm và vừa chăn nhiều về chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt ba vào cho tiền để bán được ra. và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.